The sky over northern Arizona that day looked like beaten steel, gray, dull, unmovable. Snow had been falling since morning. Not that soft kind that flutters for an hour and disappears. This snow was heavy, steady, relentless. It blanketed the trees, pressed against cabin walls, and muffled the entire world into silence. There was no bird song, no wind howling through the pines, just a thick, merciless hush. This kind of winter doesn't ask if you're ready. It just takes, slowly, quietly. Down in a basin tucked deep between ridgelines, far from any road or trail, John Merritt had been splitting logs since noon. His gloves had frozen stiff at the fingers, his shoulders hunched against the cold that found its way through even the thickest wool. 35 years old, broad-chested, calloused hands, and behind his eyes, a long kind of tired. John didn't talk much about his past, but anyone who saw the way he moved, careful, solitary, methodical, could guess he'd seen things that didn't let go easily. A war, maybe, and worse, a grief that stuck to the bones. He lived alone by design. A weather-beaten cabin, one room, warped shutters, snow packed tight around the foundation. No visitors, no neighbors, no signs of anyone else for miles. Just pine, ice, and the small routines that kept him alive. The reason for all that isolation? His wife had died nearly 8 years ago. Fever, quick and cruel. Their baby boy didn't make it through the next winter. After that, John didn't have much reason to keep going into town. Once a season, maybe, just to trade or restock. But mostly he stayed put, and folks respected that. Or maybe they just forgot about him. Either way, it worked. It's strange, isn't it? How a place can become a person's whole world, not because they love it, but because it's the only place quiet enough to live with the ache. There's a kind of man who doesn't run from pain, he just sets it down in the snow and builds a life around it. That was John. Every nail in that cabin, every board, every fence post sunk into frozen ground, all of it was a choice to survive in silence. I don't know if you've ever lived somewhere like that, not the mountains necessarily, but a headspace like that, where the quiet isn't peaceful, it's just safer than noise. I felt that kind of cold before, not in my skin, but in my chest. That dull kind, like a room that hasn't been lived in for years. You don't turn on lights in places like that. You just move through it, steady. That's where we find him, John. One man, one axe, a cabin buried under feet of snow. It's important you know this about him before anything else happens, before the story really begins, because when something finally breaks that silence, when footsteps appear in the snow and a stranger arrives, it only matters because of how long he's lived without a knock at the door. You have to feel how cold it was to understand the warmth that comes later. And in this moment, this first moment, we're still in the cold, deep in it. The snow keeps falling, the fence line disappears beneath the drifts, the forest presses in, quiet as breath, and inside that cabin, a fire cracks in the hearth while John Merritt splits wood, alone, unaware that his life is about to shift, not with force, not with noise, but with a single voice that will soon ask for help. But not yet. For now there's just winter, and a man who's decided that solitude is safer than sorrow. The snow had been falling for hours by the time John heard it. Just a sound, a faint, uneven crunch in the white silence. Not loud, not close, but enough. He stopped mid-swing, axe frozen in the air, and turned toward the trees. His breath hung in the air, thick and still. At first he thought it might be an elk, maybe a hungry stray from the ridge. Then for a second he wondered if it was a man, someone lost, or worse, someone dangerous. No one came out here by accident. If they did, they didn't last long. He stood quiet,
eyes narrowed, boots half buried in snow. And then he saw her. At first, just a shape, bare legs breaking the surface of the drift, a figure swaying under the weight of cold. She wore no shoes, just a torn buckskin dress, the kind you'd only ever see at tribal gatherings or sacred rites, not in the middle of winter, not alone, and not like this. Her skin was dark with the wind, her hair braided thick down her back. Apache. And suddenly John's gut tensed. Not from hate, he wasn't that kind of man, but from experience, from memory, from the understanding that nothing about this made sense. An Apache woman doesn't show up like this, alone, half-frozen, barefoot in white man's territory, unless something has gone terribly wrong. And maybe that's what made him freeze. Not the danger, but the grief. She stumbled closer, her arms wrapped tight to her chest, her lips cracked, her hands red from the cold. And then, not 10 yards from where he stood, she dropped. Just folded at the knees like her body had finally quit. No sound, no scream, just surrender. I don't know if you've ever seen someone that close to giving up. Not dramatically, just quietly done. It's haunting in a way you can't explain. It doesn't shout, it doesn't plead. It just asks nothing, like they've already accepted what's coming. He didn't move right away. His instincts were screaming, stay back, go inside, shut the door, let the storm finish what it started. She could be bait. There could be others watching from the tree line. That's how things go wrong out here. All it takes is one step toward the wrong kind of mercy. But then, she looked up. And her eyes weren't angry or threatening. They weren't even begging. They were just tired. So damn tired. "Please," she said, voice tight and dry. "Let me in." John didn't answer, didn't blink, just stood there, jaw clenched. He didn't owe her anything. He didn't know her name, didn't know what brought her here or what kind of trouble might follow. But still, he didn't turn away. She whispered again, "I can reward you." Her teeth chattered, her fingers shook. She had nothing. No pack, no boots, no weapons, nothing left but her breath and whatever pride she hadn't lost yet. And that's when he stepped forward. He crouched beside her slow, like you do when an animal's half wild and hurting. She didn't flinch. She didn't run. She just swayed, barely holding herself upright. Her face wasn't scared anymore. It was ashamed. "Can you walk?" he asked. She shook her head. Not dramatically, just once, small. So he lifted her, one arm beneath her knees, the other behind her back. Her body was too light, cold, rigid from the snow. But she didn't fight him. She didn't even speak again. She just let herself be carried. And that's how she came into the cabin. Not with noise, not with drama. Just a breath away from death, wrapped in silence. Sometimes I think the biggest moments in life don't come with fanfare. They don't scream at you. They whisper. And if you're not paying attention, if your heart's too hardened, you miss them. John carried her across the threshold and kicked the door shut behind them. The fire inside had been burning since noon. The smell of beans and pine smoke filled the room. He laid her down beside the hearth, the thick wool rug already warm beneath it, and pulled the heaviest blanket from his cot. She leaned her head back against the stone, her eyes half open, flicking between him and the fire. She saw the rifle on the wall. She saw his hands. She saw everything, but she said nothing. He wrapped the blanket around her legs and spoke flatly. "Keep your feet off the floor. You'll lose them if they stay that cold." Still nothing. She blinked once. That was it. John poured hot water into a tin mug, added salt and honey, and handed it to her. Her hand shook so hard she could barely hold it, but she drank. Not fast, not desperate, just slow, careful, like she knew there'd be no second chance. He didn't ask her name, didn't tell him his. It wasn't time for that. All he knew was what he'd seen, her body collapsed in the snow, her voice barely more than breath, and that was enough. You know, I think sometimes the only real act of love we get is someone choosing not to walk away. And for Tala, the woman in the snow, that was the first warmth she'd felt in days. Not the fire, not the blanket, but the fact that someone saw her, really saw her, and stayed.
The fire had been burning for hours, not just for heat but for rhythm, something to tend to, something to break the silence. John sat on his heels beside the woman, watching the flames catch in the edges of her wet braid. Her head rested against the stone hearth, body wrapped in his heaviest wool blanket, her skin still pale beneath the bronze. Her breathing shallow, her fingers red and stiff. He didn't speak, not yet. Instead, he poured hot water into a dented tin cup, added a pinch of salt and the last of the honey from last spring. Careful, quiet movements, the kind a man learns when he's been alone too long. He knelt and offered it to her. She took it with both hands, trembling as she tried to lift it, but she managed, sipped slow, eyes still on him the whole time. Not afraid, not grateful, just watching. She didn't say a word, and he didn't ask anything of her. He didn't need to know who she was, where she came from, why she'd been left to die in the snow. Not yet. Sometimes, when a life is that close to the edge, questions feel like weight. And what someone really needs is space to still be a person. You ever been there? Not in the snow maybe, but on the edge of something? Exhausted, quiet, holding yourself together with nothing but breath and will? I think a lot of people have, more than we admit. That kind of moment strips you down. You're no longer what you do or what people say you are. You're just someone trying to stay warm, trying to hold on long enough for morning. And John understood that more than most. So he didn't ask her name, didn't tell her his. He just sat there, kept feeding the fire every hour, kept checking her feet for frostbite, gently warmed them with a damp cloth. Not rushed, not too much at once. The body doesn't come back all at once. It returns in pieces. A toe, a fingertip, the breath in your chest. She hadn't cried, she hadn't begged. She didn't even thank him, but he didn't expect her to. Because the truth is, John wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't saving her because of some grand moral calling. He did it because no one deserved to die like that, alone, cold, face down in snow while the world turned away. He'd seen enough of that in the war, soldiers gasping their last in the mud, far from home, without a name on their lips. And after his wife and child were buried, he'd promised himself he might not have much to give, but he wouldn't turn his back on someone who couldn't stand on their own. Not anymore. So he stayed close, but not too close. Gave her warmth, but not pressure. The room stayed sparse, one cot, one table, shelves lined with beans and salt. A rifle on the wall, but untouched. She watched all of it, watched him. Suspicion flickered in her eyes now and then, but it faded with each log he placed on the fire, each time he refilled the kettle. He didn't treat her like a guest, but he didn't treat her like a burden either. Just human. And you know, that's rare. When someone sees you like that, not for what they need from you, not for what they assume about you, just human. At some point that night, she dozed off, knees tucked up, her face soft for the first time, and John didn't move her. He just laid another quilt beside her in case she woke cold. He ate quietly, bread and beans at the table, watching the wind push snow against the windows. The storm hadn't let up, but inside, something had shifted. Stillness, yes, but no longer hollow. Later, when the fire had burned low and the room dimmed to emberlight, John noticed her eyes open again. She looked at her feet, now wrapped in dry cloth and propped gently near the basin of warm water. Her lips parted. No sound came. Then finally, in a voice like dry leaves, she whispered, "I walked 2 days." John didn't respond right away. "No boots?" he asked.
She shook her head. Taken, when they cast me out. There was no anger in her voice, no drama, just fact. The kind that leaves a mark without ever raising its voice. John looked at her for a long moment. He could have asked why. He could have asked who they were. But he didn't. He didn't need to. The weight in her words said everything. Instead, he asked one thing. You hungry? A pause, then the faintest nod. He stood without a word, ladled beans into a bowl, tore off a chunk of bread, and set it down in front of her. She took it slow, careful, every bite deliberate, like someone who knew what it meant to go without. And when she'd eaten half, she looked at him for the first time, not like a stranger, but like someone trying to believe in kindness again. "What's your name?" he asked, voice quiet. "Tala." He nodded. "I'm John." Nothing more was said, but something had already begun. Not a friendship, not trust, not yet. Just the simple fact she was alive, and someone had stayed.
She didn't speak much at first. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't see the point. Some silences aren't fear, they're survival. Tala had been in the cabin 3 nights before she finally said more than a few words. The cold in her limbs had started to ease. Her hands, once raw and red, were now only pink at the edges. She could walk short distances, slowly, using the table for balance. And John, true to form, didn't ask. He simply noticed. They didn't talk about feelings. They didn't need to. The fire was warm, the food was enough. And in a place where the sky had no end and the snow swallowed everything that moved, sometimes enough is a miracle. But that morning, something shifted. Tala sat at the edge of the cot, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes locked on the dancing orange glow of the hearth. She hadn't moved in a while, just sat still, breathing, thinking, maybe remembering. John poured water into a basin nearby, his back turned, until he heard her voice. Low, steady. It wasn't me. He paused, turned. She didn't look at him. I wasn't the one who couldn't give him children. She said it like it had been carved into her, like she'd said it 1,000 times in her own head, and now she needed to say it out loud once, just once, so it wouldn't rot inside her. John said nothing. He sat down instead, not across the room, not too close, just beside her, quietly. She continued, "He was older than my father, a chief. Chose me for ceremony, said I was a blessing, a gift." Her voice didn't crack, not even a little. And that somehow made it hurt more. She said, I tried. They watched, waited, season after season. No child, so they blamed me. She turned her eyes to him then, and for the first time he saw it. Not just exhaustion, but the betrayal beneath it. That sharp ache that comes when your own people, the ones who raised you, suddenly decide you're less than you were the day before. Not because you changed, but because they needed someone to carry the shame. She said, they cast me out. John's jaw tightened. He didn't ask how. He didn't have to. It's one thing to be abandoned by someone you love. It's another to be deemed unworthy by an entire community. To be reduced to nothing more than a failed womb. And still, she had survived. That's what kept circling in his mind. She should have died in that snow. No food, no boots, not even a knife. Just fabric too thin to block wind and the sound of her own heart in her ears. But she made it, barely. She said after a moment,
I didn't want to die, but I accepted it. That line, that one sentence, it sat in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. And it hit me when I heard it, how many people walk through life carrying that same kind of quiet surrender. Maybe not to death, but to loneliness, to rejection, to the belief that they're unworthy because someone else told them they were. It's a cruel thing, isn't it? The way we measure a person's worth by what they can produce rather than who they are. And worse, the way we let someone else define our failure. Tala didn't cry. She didn't ask for sympathy. She was just naming her truth. And that took more strength than any speech could have held. John, in his way, understood that. He'd been on the losing end of things, too. Different wounds, same ache. He didn't offer comfort, didn't tell her it would be okay. He simply said, "You can stay here as long as you need." No promise, no expectation, just a door that wouldn't close on her. She looked at him then, not with hope, not even with relief, just recognition. Like she'd been seen without having to perform or explain. Later that day, she asked for a knife. "What for?" John asked. She pointed to her braid. "It's dirty, tangled. I don't want to carry the past on my back." He handed her a small utility blade. She didn't hesitate. Sat near the fire and cut the braid clean, just below the shoulders. Left it there on the floor, like a chapter she no longer owed anything to. And maybe that's the most radical thing anyone can do. Cut loose the story they were never meant to carry. That night, John salted meat while she peeled potatoes. Her movements slow, but practiced. These weren't the hands of someone fragile. They were the hands of someone who had labored, built, endured. They didn't talk much after that, but something had settled. A weight lifted, not gone, but shared. In the quiet that followed, John looked over at her and thought, not for the first time, that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just walks barefoot through snow and keeps going.
By the fourth morning, the storm had eased, just enough for the silence to sound less like threat and more like breath. The snow was still deep, the cold still sharp, but something inside the cabin had changed. Tala was moving again. Not much, not fast, but she didn't wait to be asked. That mattered. John had offered her a cot the night before, pulled it out from the storage corner and set it up across the room near the stove. He didn't say much, just placed a folded blanket on top, nodded once, and returned to chopping wood. He didn't tell her she could stay forever. He didn't talk about safety or gratitude or plans. He just said, quietly, "You can stay until the weather breaks." And that was enough. You ever notice how some people don't need promises? Just space. Just a small corner where they're not expected to prove themselves. For Tala, that cot might as well have been an olive branch. Not because it was soft, but because it wasn't conditional. She didn't thank him, not out loud, but she woke early the next morning, stirred the stove back to life with careful hands and boiled water for tea. Her steps were slow, her weight still uneven, but she didn't complain. And that's what struck me, reading this part of their story. The quiet way trust grows. Not in grand gestures, but in the way someone shows up, again and again, without being told. Tala started helping where she could, gathering kindling, peeling potatoes, wiping down the table. She never asked what needed doing. She just watched,
figured it out, and did it. I remember once, years ago, helping a friend after they'd gone through a brutal breakup. I didn't have advice, didn't have the right words, but I made soup, cleaned their sink, sat with them through the silence. And I realized then, sometimes the way we heal isn't by talking, it's by doing, by making something warm when everything feels cold. That's what Tala was doing. She was learning the rhythm of the place, the pace of the days, the sound the cabin made when wind pressed against its logs, how John salted meat, how many scoops of beans he used for one pot. And John? He noticed her noticing. But he didn't call it out, didn't praise her, just accepted it. That was his way. They shared meals at the table, still mostly in silence, but the silence had softened. It wasn't full of caution anymore. It was something steadier, like routine. It reminded me of the first few weeks living with someone, not in romance necessarily, but in shared space. That awkward choreography where you learn each other's steps. Who reaches for what drawer? Who needs quiet in the morning? And then, one day, it's not awkward anymore. That was happening between them, slowly, wordlessly. John still didn't ask about her past. Tala didn't ask about his. But in small ways, they were beginning to trust that what mattered had already been revealed. She'd been left for dead. He hadn't walked away. That was enough of a beginning. And maybe that's what makes this part of the story feel so real to me. It's not about rescue. It's about recognition. Tala didn't need saving. She needed space to re-enter her own body, her own voice, at her own pace. And John, gruff, guarded John, gave her that. Not because he knew how to help, but because he knew what it meant to be alone with pain. They didn't speak about the future. Not yet. But Tala started folding the blankets more neatly. She adjusted the wood pile when it leaned. She placed the tin mugs upside down to keep dust out. Little things. Things that say, I'm still here. I'm part of this now. And John, for the first time in years, let someone else's presence shape his space. Maybe trust isn't built on declarations. Maybe it's built on the sound of two people moving through the same room, each one choosing not to leave. And maybe that's what survival really looks like, not in the grand, heroic sense, but in the daily choice to keep the fire lit for someone who needs it, even if they never ask, even if they never say thank you. Because sometimes warmth speaks louder than words.
It was quiet in the cabin that morning, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for anything. Outside, the wind had softened, the snow packed into cold silence, and inside, the fire still crackled low in the hearth. Tala sat near it, legs tucked beneath her, wrapped in one of John's thick wool blankets. On the floor beside her was a knife. His, small and practical, the blade dulled at the edge from years of carving wood and cutting rope. She'd asked for it with one word and a glance. He hadn't asked why. He just handed it to her and stepped away. And now, without ceremony, she reached for her braid. It was long, black, thick, bound in a style that once meant honor, once meant something sacred. But time had turned it into a weight, and now she was done carrying it. She gripped the braid at the nape of her neck, tilted her chin slightly upward, and began slicing. The sound wasn't dramatic, just a soft crunch through hair, the dry scrape of steel. And then, done. She set it beside her, coiled and still. John saw it when he came back in with an armful of firewood. Didn't say anything, just looked, then kept stacking the logs beside the stove. That was enough, because some things don't need to be explained. Some choices, especially the hard ones, speak for themselves. You ever cut something off? Not just hair, but a habit, a role,
a version of yourself that no longer fit? I think we all get to a point where we realize that surviving one chapter doesn't mean we have to carry it into the next. That braid wasn't just hair. It was the ceremony, the title, the weight of being someone else's prize and failure. By leaving it on the floor, Tala wasn't discarding her identity. She was reclaiming it. Later that day, she helped peel potatoes while John salted a slab of meat. They didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't thick like before. It had changed. There was ease in it, familiarity, a kind of rhythm forming between them that didn't rely on questions. He didn't ask her about the ceremony, about the chief, about how long she had endured before they cast her out. She didn't ask about the photographs turned face down on the shelf, or the small wooden toy tucked in the corner of the cot. Some things were still too raw for daylight, but that didn't mean they weren't seen. They just moved around each other like people who understood pain doesn't always want to be spoken. Sometimes it just wants to be witnessed. There's a different kind of intimacy that comes when you're both been broken. When you're not trying to fix each other, just stand beside what's left. That night, after the fire was stoked and dinner cleared away, John asked her, "Did your wife die here?" Tala was sitting on the cot, combing her now shoulder-length hair with slow, deliberate strokes. She didn't pause, just said, "No, fever down in Holbrook. My boy caught it too." He didn't say more, just sat in the chair by the fire, arms folded, eyes distant. "You stayed here after?" she asked. He nodded. "Wasn't anything left down there worth staying for." And she understood that. The way loss doesn't just take people, it takes places too. It stains them, makes the air too thick to breathe. Sometimes the only way to keep living is to start somewhere silent. "You're not like most white men," she said quietly. He didn't take it as a compliment, just let the words hang. "You don't ask me what I don't want to answer." He looked over at her then. "You don't speak unless it matters." They sat like that for a while. Nothing between them but the soft pop of the fire, the smell of pine, and the shared understanding of what it meant to lose something you didn't know how to mourn out loud. That night John added an extra quilt to her cot, but she didn't use it. She fell asleep the way she had the night before, legs tucked, arms wrapped around her body, but her face was different now. It wasn't braced. And that said more than any thank you ever could. When you see someone return to themselves, piece by piece, not because you gave them answers, but because you didn't demand any, it changes you too. Tala had cut off her braid, yes, but more than that, she had stayed. And John, for the first time in years, began to wonder what it might mean to build something with someone, not just in the memory of someone lost.
The snow had started to settle into a crust, the kind that held shape under your boots, but cracked if you moved wrong. The sky was still heavy, still gray, but the blizzards had quieted. It wasn't spring yet, not even close, but something in the cold had shifted, less brutal, more bearable. A kind of waiting. That was the day John brought down the old lumber from the loft above the barn. He didn't say why, didn't announce anything, just carried the boards, one by one, and began laying them out beside the cabin. Tala stood on the porch, arms crossed inside the wool coat he'd given her, watching. Not questioning, just noticing. Like always. After a while, she stepped down onto the snow-packed ground, her steps still uneven, but sure. "You meant it," she said. He looked up. "About building something?" John nodded. "I don't say things I don't mean." There was no grand conversation, no blueprint spread across the table, just two people who had lost too much to waste time pretending they didn't want to stay. So they started building. The plan was simple. A small extension off the cabin. One room. Enough for privacy if she wanted it.
A door. A window. A roof that didn't leak. But it wasn't really about the room. It was about saying, "You're not temporary." You ever had someone make space for you like that? Not out of obligation, not to fix or own you, but just because you were there. Because you mattered. I think most of us spend a lot of time looking for that, even if we don't say it out loud. Tala didn't ask for help, but she didn't shy away from it either. She stood beside him, holding the end of the beam while he hammered. Her hands were still healing, fingers red at the knuckles, but she gripped tight anyway. She asked questions about wood grain, about how to square corners, about how to keep the nails flush so the wind wouldn't sneak in. She didn't complain, not even when the pain in her foot made her wince. John noticed, of course. He always noticed. But he didn't stop her. He just handed her a hammer and said, "We'll brace it better this time." There's something sacred about building with your hands. Maybe because it forces you into the present. Maybe because it gives weight to things that were only ideas before. A wall is just wood and nails, sure, but once it stands, it means something. By the third day, the frame was up. They stood together at the edge of it, Tala leaning slightly on one leg, her breath visible in the air. She looked at the rough boards, the open space where windows would go. Then she looked at him. "You're offering me a place. I'm offering you a choice," John said. She didn't answer right away, just stared at the frame like it might disappear if she looked away. But that night, she slept easier, didn't curl quite so tightly beneath the blanket. And for the first time, when she passed by him in the small kitchen space, her hand brushed his, on purpose. They didn't talk about what was changing between them. It didn't need a name. It wasn't a promise or a plan. It was something quieter, slower, built not from desire, but from presence. Some people fall in love with sparks, others with firelight, but the kind that lasts, I think, is the one that grows like this. Steady, real, shaped by the act of showing up. John and Tala still moved carefully. They still held space for silence. But now there was warmth in it. He started reinforcing the walls of the new room with better insulation, used the good nails, cut the joints clean. And she, in the evenings, sat near the fire stitching bits of cloth together. She didn't say what it was for. He didn't ask, but they both knew. This wasn't a story about rescue. It never had been. It was a story about rebuilding, not just the cabin, but the people inside it. Piece by piece. Choice by choice. By the time the roof went up and the wind no longer slipped through the frame, John stood at the threshold and looked back at her. "You live here now," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even an invitation. It was a truth. Said simply, said softly, and received with a quiet nod that meant more than any vow ever could.
It happened without rush, without fireworks, without need. They were sitting at the table one evening, the kind of quiet that doesn't press, doesn't expect. Tala had finished brushing her hair, now shorter but somehow stronger, like she'd let go of something but kept the root. John was oiling the hinges on an old trap box, his hands moving slow, steady, familiar. The fire cracked low behind them. The stew had long cooled. Outside, the snow whispered against the cabin, soft this time, like breath through a blanket. And then she said his name, not like a question, not to call for help, just said it, like she was letting it live in the space between them for the first time. John looked up. Their eyes met,
No stories, no speeches. She leaned forward, kissed him, gently, not urgently, but with all the weight of a person choosing something real. When she pulled back, she looked him in the eye and said, "I'm not leaving." He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. "Good," he said. And that was it. They didn't speak of love. They didn't need to. What existed between them wasn't built on romance, it was built on presence, on the fact that every day since she stepped through that door, they'd both shown up. You ever been with someone like that, where nothing has to be proven, only lived? Later that night, she lay beside him under the quilt, her bare feet brushing his. Their bodies moved together slowly, without demand. There was no hunger in it, no desperate fire, just warmth meeting warmth, survival meeting choice, a rhythm between people who'd lost too much to ever take connection for granted. And afterward, silence again. Not the kind that divides, but the kind that says, "You're safe here." Later, in the dark, Tala whispered, "If I carry a child this time, it will not belong to anyone but me." John didn't move, just wrapped an arm tighter around her and replied, "It'll belong to both of us, but no one else." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The way she exhaled, the way she sank into him just a little deeper, that said everything. And maybe that's how trust really forms. Not from words, but from what we give each other in the dark. Not from promises, but from what we never try to take away. Days passed. The air began to soften, barely. The frost didn't cling quite as long to the windows come morning. Tala still rose early, still fed the stove, still moved through the cabin without assuming anything had changed, but something had. She stood a little closer when they spoke. Her hand lingered near his when they passed each other at the table, and when their hands did touch, no one pulled away. I think about that sometimes, how the deepest kind of intimacy isn't loud. It's found in how people move around each other once the guards are down. Then one morning, as John came in from the barn, boots heavy with snow, he found her sitting quietly at the table, staring at her hands, not afraid, not in pain, but different. He hung his coat, set down his gloves, and asked, "What is it?" She looked up slowly, eyes clear, steady. "It's been weeks. I haven't bled." He stood still, just watching her, searching for what she needed him to say. "You're sure?" he asked. "Yes," she nodded. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't seeking celebration. She was seeking truth, ground. John walked over and sat beside her, close but calm. He asked, "You think it's him?" She said, "I know it wasn't me," softly. And that's when it landed. Not just the fact of it, but the meaning. This wasn't a burden. It wasn't shame. It wasn't a sentence. It was a possibility neither of them had dared to imagine. "You feel all right?" he asked. "Better than I thought I would have. No sickness, but I can feel something deep." He reached over, placed his hand gently over hers, and said, "Then we plan for that. Together." She turned her palm to meet his, gripped it tightly. "If it's true, if it grows, I want this child to live like we do. Not in fear, not under someone's name, just here, with you, with me." He didn't blink. He didn't try to dream ahead. He just nodded. That's what we'll do. They didn't make lists, didn't name it, didn't count days. But that night, he reinforced the window frames in the new room, quietly, with the good wood. And later, by the fire, Tala began stitching scraps of cloth together. Not out of tradition, not for ceremony, just because she could. Just because something was growing, and this time it was hers, theirs. Not because of what she owed, but because she stayed, and was stayed for.
The snow was melting slower this year. Spring in the mountains always took its time, crept in around the edges like a shy visitor, careful not to startle what had barely survived the winter. The trees were still bare, the ground still frozen underfoot, but the wind no longer howled through the eaves. It hummed instead, like something beginning again. Tala sat at the little table by the window, the morning light spilling across the wood, her hands still and quiet on a sheet of rough paper. A pen lay uncapped beside her. For a long time she didn't write anything, just breathed. John had gone to check the traps down by the creek. He didn't ask what she was writing. He knew. She'd asked him for the paper a week ago. One sheet, just one. He had a few tucked in an old box with his maps, saved from years back when supplies were harder to come by. He handed it to her without question. And now she stared at it like it might judge her. You ever write something so short, so loaded, that the space between the words feels heavier than the words themselves? This was that. Tala didn't know if her mother would ever read it, didn't know if the letter would even make it back to her tribe, but she had to send it. She dipped the pen into ink, steadied her fingers, and began. Mother, I'm still alive. I didn't die in the snow. That was it. No story, no apology, no explanation of how she'd survived, how John had carried her inside, how she'd burned through fever, how her feet had cracked and bled and healed. No talk of the room they'd built, of the silence that had turned into something warmer, of the small life now growing quietly inside her. She didn't owe them any of that, but she did need them to know she hadn't been erased. And maybe she needed her to know. I remember once writing a letter I never sent, not to a mother, but to someone who'd walked away when I needed them most. I kept it in a drawer for months, read it again and again until the pain dulled. Sometimes writing is how we reclaim our name, even when no one says it out loud. Tala folded the letter carefully, pressed the crease with her thumb, then slipped it into the leather pouch she'd sewn herself, lined with waxed cloth to keep it dry. Later that afternoon, when John returned, she told him she'd be going up the ridge, just for a little while. He didn't ask where, he just nodded, handed his wool scarf and said, "If the light starts fading, wait out the dark." She smiled. I know. The climb wasn't easy. The trail was still slick in spots, and her balance had changed since the baby, but she knew the path, every rock, every twisted branch. It was the same trail the runners from her tribe used, long before winter turned it into exile. At the top, near a crooked pine that had split in two from lightning years ago, she found the marker, a hollowed-out stone nestled under a flat ledge, used for decades by those who didn't speak but still needed to be heard. She placed the letter inside, covered it with the flat stone again. Nothing more. No prayer, no ceremony, just breath. She stood there a while, her hands in her coat pockets, watching the sun slide lower behind the distant ridge. The wind was softer now. The mountain no longer felt like something that would take her. And maybe that was the real reason she came, to see it from the top, this place that had almost been her grave, and to walk it on her own 2 feet. When she returned to the cabin, the lamps were lit. John was cleaning a rabbit by the fire, hands moving in rhythm, eyes steady. He looked up when she stepped through the door, snow still clinging to her boots. He asked, "Did you do it?" She nodded, took off the scarf, hung it by the door. "I don't know if she'll ever read it." She said, "You'll know you sent it," he replied. She didn't say more, just sat beside him, reached for the wash basin, and helped rinse the rabbit clean. Their hands bumped once. Neither of them pulled away.
Outside, the stars were coming out, and somewhere across the mountains, tucked under stone, was a letter that said, "Just enough. I'm still alive." And in the quiet warmth of the cabin, Tala finally believed it too.
The air smelled like pine smoke and thawing earth. Spring had finally arrived in the high country, not with a fanfare, but with small, quiet signs. The creek had started running again, trickling under its icy skin. Birds were returning, calling to each other in sharp bursts across the clearing. And inside the cabin, the light shifted differently now, warmer, softer, like it had settled in for the long haul. That morning, John found the old box. He hadn't touched it in years, buried beneath blankets and tools, tucked far back under the cot where the floor stayed cool. He didn't open it right away, just sat beside it for a while, hand resting on the lid. When he finally lifted it, the hinges creaked. Inside was a simple silver ring, dulled with age, and a faded wool coat, small, weathered, carefully folded. It had belonged to his mother. She wore it until her last winter, then left it hanging on the same hook for months, even after she was gone. He'd kept it because he didn't know how not to. But now he thought maybe it was time. Tala was out in the garden bed they'd started together, kneeling in the soft dirt, hands already dark with soil. Her belly just starting to show beneath the apron she wore tied too loose. She moved like she wasn't afraid anymore, like she belonged here now, not just as someone who survived the storm, but as someone who had built her own season. John stepped onto the porch, the box under his arm. He didn't call out, just waited. When she looked up and saw him standing there, she brushed the dirt from her palms and walked over, face calm, curious. He handed her the box, said nothing. She opened it slowly, fingers tracing the ring, then the coat. Her breath caught, but not because she was surprised, because she understood exactly what he was doing. "You're not asking me," she said. "No." "You're not offering me a name." "No." She looked up at him, steady and full. "You're giving me your mother's coat." "And the ring," he said, "but not because it makes me yours, because you already are." There was a long pause, not uncomfortable, just full. "I've been your wife," she said softly, "since before either of us said it out loud." And that was it. No ceremony, no witnesses, no promises made under sky or altar, just two people who had chosen each other, again and again, in silence, in struggle, in the space where loss used to live. I think sometimes we forget that the truest unions don't come from rituals or vows or paperwork. They come from staying, from listening, from seeing someone fully and still saying yes. Tala put on the coat. It hung a little loose at the shoulders, but felt like it belonged to her. She slid the ring onto her thumb. Not the traditional finger, not the traditional fit, but it felt right. A gesture, a bond, a kind of remembering that had nothing to do with rules. And John? He didn't try to explain anything, just stepped down from the porch and walked with her to the garden. They worked side by side, planting what would grow in that hard, high dirt. Onions, maybe, potatoes, something that could last through next winter. They didn't talk much, but now when he passed her a seed, their hands lingered. When she brushed back her hair, he noticed. When he leaned down to fix the edge of the fence, she stood behind him, just close enough to be felt. It wasn't love the way songs tell it. It was quieter, older, a kind of recognition. I remember someone once told me that family isn't who you inherit, it's who you build with. And not just with blood, but with time, with choice, with showing up, especially when it's inconvenient. That's what Tala and John had done. Chosen each other in small, continuous ways. Chosen to stay. Chosen to forgive what had come before. Other names, other titles, other wounds. No one had to tell them what they were. They already knew.
The letter had made it. Weeks had passed since Tala climbed that ridge, since she placed the message in the hollow of the old stone, her words folded tight into waxed cloth. "I'm still alive. I didn't die in the snow." That was all she'd written, nothing more. She never expected a reply, not really, not after everything. But sometimes the mountain gives something back. It came on a morning when the fog sat low on the trees and the light barely broke through the gray. A quiet knock at the cabin door. Not the sharp knock of someone in need, just a soft, almost reverent tap. John answered. Outside stood an elder, Apache, wrapped in worn wool and silence. He didn't speak, just nodded, and handed John a small cloth bundle, tied neatly with a leather thong. Then he turned and walked away, boots sinking deep into melting snow. John brought it inside, set it on the table without saying a word. Tala looked at it like it might burn. Her breath caught in her throat, but her hands were steady as she reached for it, untying the knot slowly, carefully, like opening something sacred. Inside was a strip of red fabric, simple, frayed at the edges, hand-dyed. But Tala knew exactly what it meant. It wasn't just a color, it wasn't just cloth, it was memory and forgiveness. In her tribe, red was never sent lightly. It symbolized acknowledgement, recognition of one spirit still walking the earth. For those cast out, forgotten, or believed dead, it was the thread that said, "You are not erased." Tala stared at it for a long time, held it gently between her fingers, letting the cloth breathe again. No words had come with it, no invitation to return, no request, just the fabric. In that silence, it was enough. Because in that silence, her mother had said, "I know you didn't die. I remember you." You ever receive something like that? Not an apology, not a full undoing of hurt, but just a small sign that you were still real to someone. It's strange how something so small can break open a part of you you didn't know was still clenched. Tala didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stood up, walked outside, and tied the red cloth to the branch of the pine behind the cabin. Let it flap in the wind, soft, steady, visible. And then she sat down beneath it. I remember once receiving a letter, years after I thought someone had cut me out completely. It didn't ask for anything, just said, "I see you. I still remember." And even though it didn't heal everything, it gave me permission to stop carrying the weight alone. John came out later, sat beside her in the dirt. He didn't need to ask. He knew. "You're still not going back?" he asked gently. She shook her head. They didn't ask. And if they did? She looked at the cloth again, bright against the blue sky. "I think I already made my choice." He nodded, not disappointed, just present. "Then it's done. They remembered you, but you built something new." She leaned her head on his shoulder, quiet. "It doesn't hurt the same way anymore." "No," he said. "That's what memory does when it doesn't have to prove anything." They sat there as the wind moved through the trees, as the snow melted into soil, as the red cloth whispered its own quiet truth. Tala hadn't been brought back, but she hadn't been buried either. She had been named again, and now in this place she'd nearly died. She had lived long enough to see herself whole, not through someone else's eyes, not by tribal law or bloodline, but through her own choice to stay, to build, to love. The cloth stayed on the branch all season, faded slowly in the sun, but it didn't matter, because the message had already landed. I am not gone. I am still here. And that was enough.
The snow melted quietly that year, not all at once, but in slow surrender, dripping from the eaves, softening the ground, running in thin streams down the slope behind the cabin. The kind of thaw you almost don't notice until one morning you step outside and the earth is no longer frozen beneath your boots. That was the morning the wrens came back, tiny and wild, darting between the trees like they'd never left. And behind the cabin, where there had once only been the small room and a porch, now stood a second space, walls finished, roof set, windows framed by wood they'd sanded together by hand. John was checking the hinges on the door. Tala stood in the doorway, one hand resting gently on her belly, which now curved forward with a quiet certainty. No hiding it anymore, no need. The new room wasn't big, but it was solid. Sunlight spilled across the floorboards where John had sealed them with pine tar. Tala had sewn curtains from old grain sacks. She'd chosen a soft red thread for the hem, same shade as the cloth her mother sent. "This room," she said, not looking at him, but at the light, the floor, the window that looked out over the pines, "isn't temporary." John nodded, wiping sawdust from his fingers. "It's not meant to be. It's not a place to pass through," she said. "It's a place to stay." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Some truths don't need repeating. You ever build something like that? Not just a room, but a space that means we're not running anymore. Maybe it's not wood and nails. Maybe it's a conversation, a ritual, a key handed over. But it feels the same. Inside, Tala sat on the bed frame they'd made. Her fingers moved absently over the fabric of her dress. She was quiet for a long while. Then she said, "If this child is born here, on this land, in this home, it won't carry a name that was forced on me. It won't be offered to the tribe or taken in ceremony or given to some god to explain its worth." She paused. Her voice stayed even. "It will belong only to itself and to us." John stood still. Let that settle. Then he said, "It'll be family. Ours." It wasn't a grand speech, but Tala turned toward him like she'd been waiting years to hear those exact words. She nodded once. "That's all I want." I remember holding my niece for the first time. My sister had insisted we not use the family name for her middle name, not out of spite, but out of a desire to start something new, a line free of expectation. I didn't understand it at first, but watching her grow, seeing her become entirely herself, I finally did. That's what Tala meant. This child wasn't a legacy or a replacement. It wasn't a way to fix what had broken in either of them. It was simply life. Unexpected, quiet, and deeply their own. Later that afternoon, they lit the hearth in the new room for the first time. Tala opened the window just a crack to let the spring air in. John brought in the rocking chair from the main room, an old one, back from when he thought he'd never shared this space with another soul. Now, he sat in it beside her, watching the light fall across her hands. Outside, birds sang. Inside, nothing needed saying. The room was finished, the world was changing, and for the first time in a long time, there was nothing to survive, only something to welcome. And maybe that's what healing looks like. Not erasing the past, not fixing every wound, just making room for something else to begin.